Homelessness has been rising in America's West Coast cities for more than a decade. But some places are so much more successful than others. We took a trip to Texas where the homeless population declined almost 30% over the last decade. It grew by more than 40% in California in that same time span. Today, the Lone Star State counts 90 homeless people per 100,000 residents. In California, the problem is almost 5 times as bad. The entire blocks of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Portland are occupied by tent encampments plagued by violence, drug overdoses, and disease. Not only does Texas have vastly different politics and policies from the West Coast, but it's also home to 3 large cities with 3 very different approaches to homelessness: Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. From a privately run village of tiny homes just outside Austin to a nonprofit serving San Antonio's homeless with an intensive, no-excuses treatment and skills training program to a single, centralized provider in Houston that streamlined its approach to quickly house thousands of the city's homeless residents, what we found in Texas was innovation. But the federal government doesn't fund innovation. For decades, it's committed to a one-size-fits-all approach known as housing first. States like California have followed suit, leaving many charities with a choice to either fall in line or turn down millions in federal and state grants. The result? More people living and dying on the streets as governors and big city mayors promise that the much-awaited free, permanent housing is just around the corner. Our first stop was the city of Austin, where progressive activism exists in the shadow of a conservative state house. It's a boom and bust town, a magnet for business and tech innovation, which has lured some of Silicon Valley's top performers. When the ultra-rich moved in, housing prices started to resemble San Francisco's, and the homeless population climbed. Policy-wise, Austin has a lot in common with West Coast cities, which helps explain the huge encampments here. But Austin has an advantage that San Francisco and Los Angeles don't. When you walk over the city line, you're in a more typical Texas municipality, where light-touch regulation allows innovative approaches to thrive. The outskirts of Austin are home to Community First Village, a 51-acre community of tiny homes. The project doesn't rely on federal money and, therefore, isn't bound by rules imposed by Washington. Alan Graham, who founded Community First Village, attributes homelessness to a lack of a supportive network of friends, family, and neighbors. He seeks to rebuild that network by giving formerly homeless people the opportunity to live in a community again. The homes are intentionally designed with large front porches within a walkable community to encourage socialization among neighbors. The single greatest cause of homelessness is a profound catastrophic loss of family, says Graham. Mobile Loaves and Fishes, Graham's nonprofit, launched Community First Village with about a dozen homes in 2015 and has since expanded to more than 300. The goal is to reach 500 units by the end of this year to meet the growing demand, while also breaking ground on 127 acres across the street and inside Austin, an expansion underwritten by $35 million of funds from the Federal American Rescue Plan Act that will eventually make way for 1,400 more homes. Community First Village is located just outside Austin city limits. Graham says it would have been impossible to build it on the other side of the line. A common refrain among urbanists and disgruntled residents is that Austin is like San Francisco in the 90s. Those who migrated to the city and bought houses early stand to gain from the soaring prices, but many others are getting priced out or pushed farther from the city center. We are blessed with the reality that there is no zoning, no discretionary land use authority outside of a municipal boundary, says Graham. And that's a big deal because that's the only tool that NIMBYs can sink their teeth into. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard, a term used to describe activists who lobby to block new real estate development. The city of Austin itself, which is probably where the most demand for housing would be, is hyper-NIMBY, says urbanist Scott Bayer, who has studied the interaction between zoning laws, housing prices, and homelessness. He points out that Austin's suburbs have stayed relatively affordable despite large population growth. Still, many Austinites don't appear to see the relationship between the zoning and land use changes they oppose in the fact that affordability is getting worse and worse. But such land use restrictions, especially zoning, shaped the ability of each city we visited to respond to its homelessness problem. Another crucial aspect was the strings attached to government funding. As the operator of a faith-based charity not reliant on federal funding, Graham is free to experiment, including by coming up with cheaper ways to build his tiny homes. Some tiny homes are 3D printed, while others are prefabricated, and still others are bare-bone shacks that don't contain any plumbing and require residents to use shared kitchens and bathrooms. People want our government to be risk-free, and as a result of asking the government to be risk-free, it lacks innovation, says Graham. He says the average unit in Community First Village costs about $80,000. Today, Haven for Hope offers room and board, healthcare, childcare, and even a kennel, as well as a comprehensive life skills program that includes job training, mental health counseling, and addiction treatment. The nonprofit serves about 85% of San Antonio's homeless population, serving about 7,000 people a year. According to internal reports, Haven rehouses about 1,000 clients a year. 91% have stayed in their new homes after a year. Kim Jeffries, Haven for Hope's president and CEO, says that private funding has given them the flexibility to offer services better tailored to the needs of their clients. Shelters that rely heavily on federal funding are subject to more restrictions because of the one-size-fits-all, Housing First mandate championed by Democrat and Republican administrations. The Housing First movement started in the 1980s and took off amid the George W. Bush administration's compassionate conservatism agenda. President Barack Obama completed the pivot to a federal Housing First policy with the HEARTH Act of 2009, which made focusing on rapid rehousing a requirement for those receiving federal funds. The result was predictable. Federal money was spent on pricier permanent supportive housing, and the use of temporary emergency shelters decreased. Facing a critical lack of beds, shelters started turning people away. In 2018, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a ruling that enforcement of anti-camping laws in cities lacking emergency beds was cruel and unusual punishment and thus unconstitutional. With major cities lacking adequate beds and therefore the legal right to prohibit street camping, entire neighborhoods of Los Angeles and San Francisco turned to squalor. San Antonio doesn't allow street camping, though like in any large city, it's possible to find encampments nestled beneath overpasses. Jeffries says they work with city officials to notify homeless individuals of their options in advance of an encampment sweep. And so, San Antonio doesn't allow street camping. So I think that is helpful in our success in getting people off the streets, says Jeffries. Bayer says that there should be 100 different models for homeless provision because homelessness is complex, is caused by many different factors, and often requires different solutions. In a recent policy report he co-authored for California's Independent Institute, Bayer analyzed some of the problems with Housing First. The intentions were good, but I think also the outcomes could have been quite predictable in a sense, says Bayer. If you're funding people to live on the street in a state of disrepair, and you say that even despite living like this, you're gonna get free housing, it seems like you would encourage a lot more of that behavior. Bayer argues that mandating Housing First has crippled policy innovation in major West Coast cities and that the nonprofit sector would benefit from more experimentation in their approaches to mitigating the problems that lead to homelessness. I think a lot of that innovation is getting squelched when we have a federal government that only allocates grants based on this one very specific model that we call Housing First, says Bayer. Jeffries estimates a Housing First approach would work for about 15% of the approximately 7,000 homeless individuals who come through Haven for Hope every year. The other 85% need different kinds of stability before they move into that model, says Jeffries. She says that because San Antonio invested heavily in emergency shelter beds in contrast to HUD's shift towards Housing First, the city was better able to adapt. The approach followed the funding, and so we can have different interventions for different people because we're not totally reliant on the federal government to fund it. 3 years after Los Angeles voters passed a $1.2 billion bond measure to help the city's homeless population, the city had completed just 1% of the promised 10,000 units. And the average cost of building each apartment was about $500,000. At the high end, the cost of each exceeded $800,000. Union Rescue Mission, one of the city's largest and oldest homeless service providers, didn't get any of that funding, because it didn't conform to the Housing First approach mandated by the state of California. Union Rescue Mission CEO Andy Bales told Reason in 2019 that city officials laughed at him for suggesting a different approach. "Some of my counterparts who depend on voter-approved referendum fund money, they're afraid to speak the truth," says Bales. "They can't speak the truth. Otherwise they would get in great difficulty and be defunded. I think pride and arrogance is really holding us back from doing some of the needed things we need to do to immediately solve this issue." But the winds have changed. In late 2021, an Los Angeles County supervisor appointed Bales to help oversee the county's response to homelessness. "Don't be afraid of the dogmatic housing first, permanent supportive housing people," advises Bales. "Don't be afraid of the NIMBY. There is one city in Texas where housing first is working well." As the New York Times reported last year, Houston has reduced its homeless count by more than 60% over the past decade, while placing more than 25,000 people in permanent units. So how did America's fourth largest city succeed by going all in on housing first while Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Portland have failed so miserably? Anna Rausch, Vice President of Program Operations at the Coalition for the Homeless of Houston and Harris County, says it partially has to do with appointing a single agency as the first point of contact for any homeless person seeking help. While many cities have several organizations in this role, Rausch says this centralization makes it easier to efficiently route clients where they need to go and to track outcomes. She says that the housing readiness approach in San Antonio, which has a metro region population about 1/3 the size of Houston's, wouldn't scale. "You're basically paying to leave people homeless in a courtyard in San Antonio," says Rausch. "See which costs more. I've been doing this for 23 years, and the housing first approach works." Several studies have shown that housing first is better at keeping chronically homeless people with serious mental illness off the street than more intensive, housing readiness interventions. But other research has cast doubt on its effectiveness, its impact on health outcomes, and whether its results hold up over time. Besides limiting innovation in homeless services, governments also make housing artificially expensive. Rausch says that the reason housing first works in Houston but not in Los Angeles has everything to do with the cost of building.